Guys, my name is Bill Tennant. I look after global sales for, sorry? Everybody good? Okay. I look after global sales for ZAP. I'm joined by Trey Johnson. Trey is our chief evangelist and a hell of a lot smarter than me. So I get the enjoyable part of kind of walking around and showing slides and talking to you about what we do, and then he gets to show you. And then afterwards, he can talk to everybody about what we do, answer any questions. It's tough to answer questions in this forum, but we are at the booth. We're at 420 and very happy to answer questions. Can I get a show of hands? Who in the audience is more of a business analyst, finance user? Who's more on the IT technical side? Awesome. And a little bit of everything else in there, I'm sure. Perfect. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to walk through and take you through how ZAP actually eliminates the headaches that are associated typically with reporting. We all know and we've all seen the great visualizations that Tableau provides. You've probably walked around this show floor and seen 50, 60 different businesses that say that they do all elements of data. Now that's fantastic, right? Everybody does a little bit with data. There's data cleanse, there's data prep, there's data cataloging. We don't do that. What we do is we have smart connectors associated with, typically to start with, really complex ERP systems. So you may have an old bond system with 240,000 tables. You may have an SAP system with 20,000 tables. You may have a Dynamics system with 5,000 tables. We know these systems. We profile the data with our smart technology, and we automatically detect and deliver relationships through our smart data connectors and our pre-built data models. Beyond that, we give you the ability to integrate rapidly multiple data sources. So a lot of organizations are looking at this from a mid-market perspective. So you may not have 10 data scientists in your business. Or if you do, you want them to be entirely focused on actual data prep. You want them to be focused on delivery of predictive analytics. You want them to be looking at the statistical side and actually getting people to the point where they see and they can understand and they can deliver meaningful outcomes to the business, not developing financial reports and financial dashboards. That's the basics, right? In the crawl, walk, run scheme of BI as a whole, we're all sitting here hoping that we can get to the point where we can make use of every product that's in this vendor roadmap in the community. But at the end of the day, when you're focused on keeping a business lean, growing through these great economic times, and delivering something meaningful and impactful rapidly, you don't need a team of data scientists focused on financial reporting or focused on supply chain or inventory turnovers. What you need is those folks using Alteryx or using some of the other solutions that you see out here to really get into the sophisticated aspects of that. Get to the point where they can be successful delivering predictive and leverage those solutions, because frankly, at the end of the day, these are going to be people that you trust, people that you have focused on elements of your data that if you don't have data governance, you're screwing your business. That's the point, right? You don't want to put yourselves in a position where they're getting access to data they shouldn't. You don't want to give them access to all these different data sources and not know if the data is accurate. These folks are extremely intelligent and they're sophisticated and they're using this data to deliver rapid outcomes. But what we do is we take those core systems, and we've used these as examples because of our smart connectors, where we can actually get you up and running. Quite literally, we deployed a solution against 2 or 3 different data sources, starting with ERP, in a matter of hours the other day, with thousands of tables and the smart relationships. The ZAP Data Hub is taking those smart connectors and allowing us to deliver that through pre-built data models, but also taking into consideration the customizations that are associated with it. And within those customizations, we can actually pull those in rapidly and have the automated integration points so that your Tableau dashboards can be up and running very quickly. You can deliver through things like Excel, but you can also take that and couple together all the other data sources. So if you have a finance user, the very interesting thing that I find is if you have a finance user as an example, and you have a data warehouse team and you have a data science team and they're using Alteryx, but they also have a data warehouse. You give a finance user access to the full complexity of your data warehouse, and they're going to get lost fairly quickly, right? They're going to ask for, just give me the raw data, just give me my GL, just give me my trial balance. But if you have this data and you put it in a position where it's actually usable for that finance user because you can drill down and you're not creating 300 different disparate data marts, and you're not putting yourself in a position where all these different data sources are being brought together inside of the data warehouse in a complex way, but you're giving them something that's easy to use and simple, that's where we can deliver these rapid outcomes through Tableau and through other means so that they can quickly and easily get access to the information they need. And a great example, one that we find to be frankly, as much as everybody talks about and looks at data visualizations and says how they can get to this very quickly, it's really challenging. You have an ERP data and you have ERP data and you have HRM data. So you may have an HRM system that is showing all of your labor data. Or I know we talked to a company earlier associated with payroll. You know, if you have payroll data, we have a company in San Francisco, just north of San Francisco, that leverages our solution for Microsoft Dynamics as well as Paycom. We're dropping Paycom data, salary data out so their labor data can be delivered through a dashboard exactly like this that gives them access to things like overtime trends, information associated with pieces that are in disparate parts of maybe the ERP or maybe associated with the individual areas of the business that are in multiple data sources. But why would you bring a flat file with payroll data into your full data warehouse and put that through the rigor of the data governance process if it's just something where you need it for one component associated with the relationships for overtime? Or you want to look at hours by work center and you need to be able to see what are my hours by work center, what's my actual labor cost associated with that, and what's my machine cost, what's my actual maintenance cost, and how does all of that flow together? All of these pieces need multiple data sources. And we don't need to have 10 data scientists working on trying to develop that. We need them to be able to look at this and then take it 2, 3, 5 steps further and take you to the next level as a business. So overall, and again, we can go through all aspects of this. Trey's going to walk you through what we do from a data modeling perspective. But again, this is how we easily take this data, we couple it together with multiple data sources and put you in a position to be successful, and then leverage things like data prep, Tableau prep. Leverage things like Alteryx if you need to. All these pieces flow together to give you a solution that really gives you meaningful outcomes with your structured data rapidly. Over to you, Trey.
Okay, so this is a kind of a strange experience wearing a headset and hearing myself talk to you. But what we're going to do today is just show you a little bit about our product. If you look at your neighbor, a few of your neighbors have green headsets still, so that means that they've totally missed what he said, which might be okay, but we want to make sure that everybody hears what we have to say now. So what I'll do is just simply pull up the RDP session that we have going on, and what we're going to be looking at is ZAP has a product, and the product is ZAP Data Hub. And so as Bill was describing, what we do with Data Hub is we're actually connecting to a variety of disparate data sources, bringing them all together. We start typically with one of our smart data sources as kind of the foundation. So everybody starts with something like an ERP or something like a primary application, and then you kind of basically expand your footprint from there. And a lot of the reason for that is so many people are using tools like Tableau to start with an initial data source, and then the needs and the requirements kind of go beyond that initial department. And the next thing you know, you have salespeople that have a vested interest in some of the things the finance folks are looking at, or vice versa. And so you really have to build out that data platform that goes across the entirety of the business, or at least across a larger constituency than you started with. And so that's what we actually do with our technology. And so you can probably see on the screen, I apologize if it's in any way hard to read, but the basics are what we're looking at is browser-based application, that is ZAP Data Hub. Within the ZAP Data Hub environment, we can create a new model. I'm going to go ahead and start with an existing model. This particular model is built off one of the Microsoft Dynamics applications called Finance and Operations for D365. And that is a very comprehensive data source, thousands of underlying tables that are kind of the starting point. Not the best place to just point Tableau directly and try and extract data, because there'd be a lot of things you'd have to do manipulation-wise, but a great place to start with our tool set, because we have the inbuilt intelligence for that particular data store. We can bring forward a template as a starting point, and as you use this application, you're essentially manipulating that template. You're choosing to add things that maybe are unique to your environment, your deployment, whatever the case might be. One of the things that's a very common scenario is you see there's a couple of data sources listed here. Again, D365 is the primary data source. If I click on this Add Data Source button, I actually already have the tab open. These are all of the different data sources that we support. And some of the ones you see up there are slightly grayed out. Those are just kind of forthcoming data sources for us. But the important part about this is, while there's not an overwhelming number of icons on the screen, there's all of the right technical connectivity. So where it's not a direct connector because we haven't explicitly put out that one application's name, there's a broad variety of connections that are available whether it be through traditional ODBC or ADO.NET or cloud-based OData connectivity. We can also call REST APIs. We can also pull in data that's in JSON formats, XML formats. So there's a lot of different ways that we can consistently bring that information together. And the model is really kind of the starting point of you essentially defining what you want to pull from a variety of data sources, land in essentially a data warehouse. So our technology works as an intermediary between your data sources and whatever is that resulting SQL Server data store, or in the cloud, potentially an Azure SQL database or other platforms as a SQL destination. And so if I go back here, I'm not going to actually add a data source in this particular demo, but if I go back to the model definition itself, I'm going to collapse data sources, I'm going to expand pipelines. Pipelines by our definition are just a very simple noun that serve to deliver data from a source to a centralized destination. And so we can do things in a manipulative way across the pipelines. So if you do have some things that you ultimately want to do to transform the data, you can. Our model is more of an ELT type model. In other words, we're extracting the data from the source system first, then we're applying the transformations after we've loaded it into a staging environment. And what that does is that takes all of that burden off of the traditional things that you might do in memory or in process directly against a data source that, you know, there might be some stability issues or other things that would occur in that regard. What you're seeing on the screen, and again, my apologies if it's a little bit hard to read, is you're not seeing cryptic table names. And part of the reason for that is when we connect with our smart connectors to these different applications, not only were we pulling out the data and the schema information, but we're also pulling out the metadata information as well. So in other words, we can get all of the labeling that you've done with your vendors, you know, around, in this case, a Dynamics 365 implementation, or whatever is the case with the different smart connectors that we have. We're bringing that information out, that metadata out, so you can have modules, you can have different ways of really looking at your data versus a cryptic 16-character name that doesn't really translate well into what you've typically seen within your applications. And so there's a number of things that are kind of just relevant on this screen. So we do list the table name, we do list the data source. Within the context of the data source, we're actually automatically discovering a lot of the relationships between all the entities. Oftentimes with the smart connectivity, the application is describing it already for us, which is great. Otherwise, we have heuristics that are built in when we look at a data source. We can look for the traditional primary and foreign key things. We're also looking at column naming, and we go so far as to actually profile the data. We'll look at the data types, we'll look at the values, because you can kind of, through those heuristics, detect it, even if the columns name the same thing, and in one column it's a Y and an N, and the other one it's a 1 and a 0, that's not exactly data that should be associated or related to one another. And so the pipelines themselves, you know, can kind of take on a variety of different forms. I actually have one that's already up, so I'll just kind of start with that one. And what we do within our pipelines is we basically approach it as there are multiple steps within a pipeline. And so as a result, you may have some scenarios where you simply want to make the data mimic what it looks like in the source application. Therefore, you're not really doing anything transformative with it, which is fine. You just simply would not have any steps. The initial step is kind of the originating format. That's what it looks like coming from the data source. From there, there's a variety of things that we can do in terms of net new steps. And so if I kind of mouse over this or even just click on add step here, what my options are is I can do a basic step, which is more for kind of organizing, you know, kind of the information that we want to use. We can do a union step, which is really popular, especially with our customers that have a net new ERP and they have one or more legacy ERPs, where they're actually unioning or bringing together data from historical sales ledgers, historical other ledgers, and streaming that basically into their new ERP environment. By the way, when you do that in a tool set like this, you're dramatically saving yourself costs and other things associated with data migration. And we've seen plenty of ERPs that kind of start off on shaky ground because the first thing they tried to tackle was migrating all of their data from their legacy ERP and kind of force fitting it into the new ERP. And as a result, you know, nothing actually performed very well for them. And so that union step is very helpful in that regard. There's a couple of transformative things that we can do. There's SQL. that can simply just be issued directly against the input column, so you can do a lot of manipulation in that way. There's aggregation and pivot functions, and new to the product, or relatively new to the product, as we've just recently introduced history. And so what history allows for us to do is really approach and tackle all of the slowly changing dimension requirements that organizations typically have, where you want to preserve elements of the history. You want to see that if it's a sales opportunity, when did its status move from probable to highly likely, or things of that regard. In addition, it really allows for those scenarios where you need to actually be able to associate with what the data looked like at a particular point in time. Also built into the product, and I don't exactly have an example to show today, is we also have design patterns for things like taking snapshots on a recurring basis, which is obviously a little bit difficult just simply in a tool like Tableau only against a data source, where maybe you want to accumulate snapshots around your inventory transactions or other things, so I can say, well, what did the inventory look like last Wednesday compared to that same time last year, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of capabilities that are naturally inbuilt into the pipelines themselves. As I kind of look down this list, and I'm actually going to change to another step here, we've called it calcs. There's a number of things that we do that are just naturally in the form of calculations. And so what I can do is I can add a calculation, and what a calculation actually is it's more or less, and because we're running in a SQL Server environment or a SQL Server oriented environment, it's a T-SQL expression. So it is essentially things that you would traditionally do, date time or character parsing or conditional statements around like a case function, things in that regard. In addition, just to the left of this is a lookup option. If I click on lookup and let that drop down, what you'll notice is there's a number of items that are listed here. And our primary paradigm for users to be able to add to the schema is a checkbox paradigm. So what you're seeing listed here is you're seeing a number of the related pipelines that are out there and are available in this model. And sometimes it just naturally makes sense to, let's go ahead and pull something. In this case, we could pull, this is inventory. We might pull some item information and just directly make it part of these transactions so it's easier to report on. You can do that very easily. So if I go down this list, well, we'll just use units for an example. There's a number of characteristics around the units. There's class of units and other. If I check the box here, that basically now makes this part of the pipeline. And what that ultimately means is when a user comes to report off of this particular pipeline within the resulting warehouse schema, they'll have that additional data element available to them. So it adds a little bit of richness, a little bit of additional dimensionality, typically to tables, where maybe it was missing otherwise. So does that make sense? I see heads nodding, so I'm glad for that. So excellent. So there's multiple other things we can do within the context of the model itself. You will notice out the right-hand side, it's a little bit hard to see from a property standpoint, but we can also target the data to analysis services. And so what that ultimately means is you can be designing not only for a relational model, but you can also be designing for an analysis services format as well. And that for reporting and the fact and the dimension information, that just drives some configuration elements within the relational data store too. So we'll actually add some keys and some other things within the relational schema so that tools like Tableau, plus other tools like Power BI and the like will work with it. So that's basically the capability and functionality within the pipelines. If I bounce back real quickly, just to touch on a couple of the other areas that are potentially important, relationships we don't really need to talk about because again, those are automatically detected. The only thing that I might mention about that is you also have the ability to relate across data sources, which then becomes a very powerful thing in terms of the ultimate resulting schema, because I can do lookups now across the schemas as well. So I might have an Excel file as one of my data sources that's complementary to my ERP. I can actually then start to blend the data. I can establish relationships. I can have data that's very portable across those two data sources for that purpose. The next kind of element in the model that we have is called a process configuration. And what this basically allows us to do, I apologize again for the properties not being the easiest to read, but it allows us to basically say, what are we doing in this particular configuration? Because we're always going to trigger some processing of this. Remember, we're just a tool, we're an intermediate piece, pulling data out of your data sources, landing it into a central destination. So you kind of need to tell the tool when it should run. And so that's what a process configuration is. And within the process configuration, you can say, I want this to run for everything, or maybe I want it to run for a subset of my pipelines or a single data source. You can choose the frequency with which it runs. So I can choose a schedule that's, every day of the week at a particular time, or you can choose an interval basis. And what we do is we automatically pick up incremental processing across all of the pipelines. What that ultimately means is you can incrementally refresh data across any of those pipelines at an interval that makes sense for your business. Your finance team, particularly at period end, closing, well, they may need the finance data refreshed every 15 minutes because they're maybe running things like financial statements off of this same data. Conversely, the sales team, no offense to salespeople, but they might be looking at it once a day. So you don't necessarily need to worry about making that data as fresh and available as the finance data needs to be. So you can do that with these process configurations. And it's this piece, this process configurations, that also allows for invocation from other tools. So if you have other orchestrating tools that you want to say, hey ZAP, go off and do some processing, you can call this process configuration, it'll do its thing, build out the warehouse. If you had some other things that were more machine learning or otherwise related, kind of downstream from the warehouse being built out. And there's other things that are available here, and I'm conscious of the time and the fact that we're between you and lunch, so we'll keep this moving. But the database scripts is also kind of a healthy part of this. Oftentimes, because if you're familiar with SQL Server, you've kind of lived and breathed SQL Server for a while, database scripts and working with data in sets tends to be a lot more performant. So you may have some things that you just simply want to do where you want to do an update across, say, an entire table or something along those lines. And that's just something you naturally do at the beginning or at the very end of when all of this runs. You can do that here. So we can support the database script processing and the, kind of the further blending of the data in that regard. There's also support for parameterization. The parameters themselves, without getting overly technical, just think of them as ways that you can kind of set a global value that you can then address within a script, you can address within a calculation. So if you were kind of focused on a particular time zone or something along those lines, you could make sure everything kind of calculated out in the right way. You'll notice on the screen here, we have geocode key, geocode level, those sorts of things. We have the ability to invoke like geocoding services. So in other words, if you're pulling in an address, you can bounce that address off a geocoding service, can get you back, your lat long, those sorts of things. Lat long obviously plays a little better in some of the visualizations that are in Tableau and in terms of the geographic placement and those sorts of things. And then, lastly is, kind of the security elements. And so we could spend probably too long on this, but suffice it to say, this is an opportunity to add members to a particular role, and then you can apply that security, across elements of the schema. So for example, I could have, Bill and myself are a great example. Maybe I have visibility to customers in the state of Florida where I reside. Bill being higher up in the sales organization, maybe he has visibility to customers across the world. So we could actually set up that dimensionality that says, based on the customer's location, I can or cannot see who those folks are. And so that security can then be made part of this, so that whether you're using Tableau or whatever tool you're using, you'll have that security invocation and that assurance that you're really refining the data based on the user, much more so than trying to build reports that are the Florida version of the report versus the national version of the report. Hopefully that makes sense. So, and then the very kind of last element, and sorry we're having to take such a quick tour here, is we also support the building out of calculations. And as you might imagine, we've put a lot of effort and energy into the things we do for ERPs as more of a kind of a packaged offering. And so in this case, we have 400 and some calculations that are kind of in the box. Those are just really the intended starting point where you can kind of build out the calculation that you want to make available, and it could potentially be viable for you if you're using the Tableau solution. Otherwise, you always have the flexibility of building the calculation on the pipeline or the calculations within the Tableau product itself. So the end result is, obviously the things that one would expect to see. You have the output, which is that SQL-based data warehouse. From there you can actually use Tableau on top of it. So I guess one of my questions is, for the group, and just by a show of hands, do you already have data warehouses in place today? Okay, so we've got some nods and some hands raising. That's pretty typical. I mean, it's based on what we've experienced on the booth. There's people that already have a warehouse in play. There's some that would like to have a warehouse in play. There's some that, it's a project that's on the horizon. I think, if you have the opportunity, come by the booth, talk with us in each one of those scenarios. I think we, have some solutions for you. So with that, and Bill, I don't know if you had any, kind of closing remarks. I know we've got a few minutes left.
No, Trey, thanks. The only thing that I would ask is if there's any questions, we're happy to take them. I know it's challenging with these, but happy to take any quick ones now or back at the booth. Excellent. Thanks, everyone.